This is Jim McAndrew for Camera 3. Today, Camera 3 welcomes two most exciting new film directors, Agnès Varda and Susan Sontag, in a discussion of their work and the condition of the modern cinema. We shall see excerpts from their films, Miss Varda's Lion's Love and Miss Sontag's Duet for Cannibals, both of which have been accorded the honor of being shown at the 7th Annual New York Film Festival. There are interesting similarities and differences in the work of these two filmmakers. Duet for Cannibals is Miss Sontag's first film, she being primarily known as a literary critic and an unsentimental observer of the state of contemporary culture. Lion's Love is not Miss Varda's first film. She is French, and yet she made this film in America. Miss Sontag is American, but she made her film in Sweden. Both films might be described as being interested in the grotesque, and yet both might also be described as political. Both are quite certainly films that could not have been made 10 years ago. Unraveling some of these matters with Miss Varda and Miss Sontag is another Camera 3 guest today, Jack Kroll, senior editor of Newsweek.
Miss Varda, when Jim said the word grotesque, you reacted sharply to that.
Yes, I think.
Would you deny that your film has anything to do with the grotesque?
Neither Suzanne's movie.
Yeah. Well, answer that if you would, please. Why
I
do you
don't
think,
see why, I mean, the word grotesque means something, in art at least, means something.
Yeah.
And I think these two movies are very classical.
Well, I have a feeling that, at least in the case of your film, Lion's Love, perhaps one is thinking about the people, the stars, as we
the
say in
stars
America.
of my film were Viva, Jim Rado and Jerry Ragni are not grotesque people at all. They have long hair, and they live like free people. I think doesn't mean...
Let's identify them. Viva, of course, is most known as one of Andy Warhol's so-called superstars.
Yes.
And Ragni and Rado are the authors of Hair.
Yes, they wrote it and they acted in the
Yes.
they acted in the play.
And you would not call them grotesque. in
Not
any
at
way.
all.
Yes.
Not at all.
And yet, obviously, for some people, especially Viva, and even Ragni and Rado, are marginal people, or people that one would not encounter in the normal course of events,
Well,
if there is such a thing as a normal
maybe
course
they are
of
not the
events.
majority, and that's why maybe it's very interesting to do a movie about them and try to show them in their normal, everydayness life.
Could you give us briefly a kind of, what's the storyline of Lion's Love, very briefly? What happens in it?
Three young actors, of the new breed of actors, come to Hollywood. They want to succeed, to make a career or something there. And they live together in a very nice and quiet conjugal life.
Ménage à trois, you would say.
No, ménage à trois looks always a little dirty. No, it's just three people together, I guess. And on the other hand, a director, Shirley Clark, who is a woman director, comes also in Hollywood to try to make a deal and make a movie. And she stays with them. They invite her to stay. And all the story happens. It's not a story, in fact. It's a chronicle, I would say. Happens in June '68 when Bobby Kennedy was campaigning in California, and he was shot and he died. So it's just a week in California in June '68, and it's mainly a film about stars to be, political stars, how to be a star, stars of the old Hollywood, there is a sort of smell of the big 30s.
So that what you're saying, Bobby Kennedy, political figure, is in a sense a star,
Well,
as much
sure.
of a star in his way as Harlow
Political
was.
figures in America are stars.
Well, let's say then that Viva and Ragni and Rado are perhaps a new kind of star for most American film goers. Why don't we take a look at these new kinds of stars and see what happens to them in your movie?
Jim. Nice. Are you from New York? Born there, me and 7 million others. What kind of movies are you making? I'm supposed to be making a film.
Well, there we have these non-grotesque people.
It's a racist position. I'm sorry.
It's a what kind of position?
Racist.
Racist? You mean?
Yes, if you find that some people are so different,
Yes.
they're just the way.
Well,
their
I'd
life
like
is
to
different.
talk about that for a moment because, as I'm sure you know, and as Susan Sontag certainly knows, because you've written about this kind of thing in the arts, the Andy Warhol film and your famous essay on camp and so forth. For a lot of critics...
I never read about any film of Andy Warhol.
No, but I mean of the underground film and the non-establishment film and so forth and so on.
I haven't written about that either, but I have opinions about it.
Well, then let me ask the both of you. As you know, of course, for many, maybe most critics, establishment-type critics, let's say, the gradual and yet in some sense sudden and rather astonishing entrance and influence of people like Warhol and performers such as Viva, these people have started to very strongly influence the mainstream in filmmaking and in culture generally. Here they are. They used to be on the margins and on the fringes and were seen by a very limited type and number of people. And suddenly we find them in your film. And this upsets a lot of people. I'm being the devil's advocate here. You hear, why should we be interested in these people? What is the significance of this kind of person and of their characteristic experience for us? I think it's a question of some importance, and I'd like to hear what both of you have to say about that.
I disagree completely with you, Jack, because I think one of the things that I like best about Agnes's film is it's one of the few films that I've seen in a long time where I recognize real people. And far from being grotesque, as I say, one of the interesting things about the film is that there really are lots of people like this, and that the film shows them, whereas most people you see in movies have very little relation to real people. That isn't bad either. I mean, that's one of the conventions of art. The relation of art to real life is very complicated and very ambiguous.
Well, let me say again, I'm playing the devil's advocate here. For what it's worth, I agree with you.
In the average Hollywood movie, you don't see real people, either mainstream
Exactly.
people or marginal people. You see ideas that people have about what people are supposed to be or the way people are supposed to be represented in
And
film.
also the language problem. Like people speak. I mean, I'm not the best to speak. I'm not the best one to argue about the way of speaking.
Yes, just
the way people speak in the real life is rarely represented in movies.
Although those barriers are being more and more broken down, aren't they? In film and on stage
slowly.
and in
Sure,
literature.
it is about time.
Yeah.
I mean, just take a very simple thing like the fact that people traditionally in films don't interrupt each other when they talk. You say your line and the other person says his line and so on. Whereas everybody interrupts each other in
there
real
have been
life.
some pioneer directors who have tried to bring that in quite... Orson Welles, for example,
Yes.
I'm sure you remember,
Yes.
and Citizen Kane was almost the first Hollywood director I can think of who did that so well. But perhaps I think it would be interesting to bring your film in at this point, because I think it's the other side of the coin. In Miss Varda's film, we have Viva, we have Jerry Ragney, Jim Rado, very special people indeed, although very real people. Now, in your film, Duet for Cannibals, we have, on the other hand, people who on the surface appear to be in the mainstream. We have Bauer, who is some sort of political philosopher or pundit, professor, whatever he may be. You have the young man and his mistress. You have Bauer's wife. On the surface, John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger, if you will. And yet, as the film develops, and as we get to know these people more and more, especially Bauer, especially the philosopher, the political scientist, whatever he is, we find that behind the seemingly normal or mainstream surface, there are convolutions and all sorts of interesting things that one would not see in the public dimension. So perhaps that is one point where these films come together.
Yes, well, in a sense, the older couple, Bauer and his wife, they're actors. I mean, they in the story of the film, he's a political refugee, a political leader, if you will, and the wife is, his wife from his Italian wife. But one of the possible ways of looking at the film is that this is that they're really actors, that this is the role that they're playing in this relation with the younger couple, and
they
that
draw,
you don't know
they
really
draw the
what
younger
they're
couple
like
into
that you don't know
their,
what they're like at all, so that
Yeah.
the surface, while it's realistic, is not at all necessarily genuine.
And they carry this role-playing about as extremely far as one can.
Whereas the
Isn't that
younger
true?
couple is treated quite realistically. There are lots of people like that.
Well, even to the point of questioning what is life and what is death, you find Bauer and his wife shifting back and forth until one can hardly be certain at the very end of the film who is alive and who is dead. Now, this is really carrying role-playing to an extreme. So I think in both of these films you have people who are so caught up and involved with role-playing on very different levels.
But I don't think it's true of Agnes's film.
You don't think so?
I mean,
she
should say...
Don't they want to be stars, as you said?
I would say they want to be stars, and my film is maybe about acting or not.
But the point is that they are the same. If they were stars, they would be themselves.
They're trying to be themselves, and they make it, I mean, clearly enough and loud enough so they would become normal, real stars.
I think in Agnes's film, the people are actors, but what's interesting about them is that, you know, as actors, they're no different. They would act themselves.
Whereas they're on all the time.
They're on all the time. That's right.
Stories. Anyway, what I like in Suzanne's story, it's about this, comment on dit this?
Vice.
Vice.
Yeah.
And it is really interesting. Well, yes, because it's the way, I mean, it's not the way you live, it's the way you intend to spoil people.
Okay, in your film you have these three people living together. And eventually in Susan's film you have, menage à quatre in a sense, the four people come together in a very disquieting way. And perhaps we ought to take a look at such a scene right now from Susan's film.
Oh, yes.
Bauer gick helt upp I sina minnen från sitt tidigare liv som politiker.
Kanske var jag mer idealistisk på den tiden.
Ni menar mer revolutionär?
Det dröjer innan revolutionen kommer.
Är tiden inne för revolution?
Antingen för tidigt eller för sent.
Då är det rätt tid då.
Det är nog fel på maten.
Vadå, jag tycker det var all right.
Ta bort maten. Och ni kan packa era saker. Vi behöver det inte längre. Vi behöver det inte längre. Jag tror att maten är förgiftad.
Ingrid.
Vad är det?
Ingenting. Drick inte mer. Du vet att du inte tål det.
Tack. Jag föreslår en skål för vår gäst.
En utmärkt idé. Till den förtjusande Ingrid. Nej, jag tror ni redan har fått tillräckligt med en unge man. Jag vill att ni ska vara klara i hjärnan för morgondagens arbete. Ska vi gå in I salongen?
Well, let me ask you. It's a very strange movie. Politics, yeah, I think it's strange. Politics is involved in some way. One is forced to think about that category. And as Miss Varda has said, vice, and therefore virtue, I suppose. But you mix up all the human categories in a fascinating way. The sexuality of these people, the ideology of these people, are played with in, I think, a unique fashion. And although it's the gauchest possible question, why? What's going on here?
Well, you're really asking several questions at the same time. As far as the politics goes, I just picked that background to locate the story.
In other words,
it's not a political film. It assumes a certain political milieu, which, I mean, since I made the film in Sweden, it's even more realistic, more just for Sweden, for Stockholm, let's say, than perhaps for New York, although one can certainly find similar circles in any big city like New York or London or Paris. And but what's important in the film, or the material of the film, is the relationships between the people within that situation or in that background. It doesn't necessarily have to have been a story about people involved in politics. The basic story is the relationship of the two couples.
Well, I think that for many people who have never really thought about what lies behind the facade of a public person, of a political figure.
Oh, I'm not trying to say that.
I know that you're not trying to say it.
People are frauds.
No, I wasn't thinking of fraudulence at all. But there's something behind a public facade. I think one tends to think of people who seem to exist primarily in the public eye as somehow a separate subspecies.
Yes, sure.
They are public effigies. And one is sometimes shocked when brought nose to nose with, as in the case of the Kennedys in various ways. These are living human beings with all, as I said before, all the labyrinthine convolutions that belong to us and to characters in a novel by Dostoevsky. And for me, that's a powerful point. I think you may not have meant to make that point in your film, but I think it's no accident that you do have an ideological character at
yes,
the center.
because the
of this.
attraction of the younger couple to the man, to Bauer, is because they admire him. He's a hero of theirs,
Yes.
and
For his ideology.
For his ideology, and
Yeah.
of course they don't even think about what he's really like as a person, and they resist thinking about it as long as possible because they want to go on admiring him.
And one follows their confusion, their shock, their revulsion, and their perverse attraction to this. And on the other hand, in your movie,
Yes,
we
maybe
have...
it's the same point. I mean, maybe the three actors who look so fancy, so daring, so, hippie type and so on, if you start to try to know them, understand them, they are finally very quiet people. I mean, I don't want to make it so...
I think they make them
Opposite.
very attractive.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, they are not so freaky that then they look like.
Yes, as they look like.
As they look like. And that's maybe something nice to...
And you show
Sure.
that by the way in which they react to these awful and very extreme events, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the shooting of Andy Warhol.
The political thing here comes through a little box, which is the TV. And nobody right now, nobody can be out of the world like it was possible 20 years ago because of the TV.
There's no escape, even in that little plastic
So a lot of
part.
people, and a lot of people are not interested in politics, and they don't even want to know too much. But they have to know because of the TV. So maybe that's one point where a certain kind of people who are not interested in politics are confronted
Confronted, yeah.
confronted with something happening, and well, they have reaction. Not so much. I mean, not political
Their reaction is a personal reaction. They're
Yes.
moved by Kennedy as a person.
As a person.
And then they go back to their way of living.
In fact, it
I'm
makes...
interested in the mixture of two different worlds, as political world and really private lives.
And I think something like that, in a completely different way, is happening in your movie. I think that, in the early part of the program, you denied having written about Andy Warhol and so forth. What I was thinking, do you remember a piece you wrote in Partisan Review? You talked about Taylor Mead and Tiny Tim. Do you remember?
Yes,
And
well,
a play
but
by
no,
Rosalind Drexler. No, I'm about to make a point. You said, if I remember correctly, I think you had the ghastly luck to be doing drama criticism at that point in your career.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
You remind me of
Yes,
past sins that I'd rather forget.
And you said, if I recall correctly, you remembered a performance by Taylor Mead in a play by Frank O'Hara, I think, and you remembered a performance by Tiny Tim. This is much before he's become
Yes.
the Tiny Tim,
Yes.
and I think it was at page 3. And you remembered a play by Rosalind Drexler, I think it was Home Movies, and I think you said the thing you liked about all three of these things was the authenticity of the people. Tiny Tim was himself. He was an authentic person. tailor-made was himself. Do you recall that? And
I don't, but I
That
can
sounds
imagine
right, doesn't
saying
it?
it, yes.
Yeah, you did say. And that's why I brought up this category before. I think Viva fits into. You would probably say the same thing about Viva.
But of course, I've changed a lot, and I don't feel very connected with those essays that I wrote a long time ago. But I would say, if I think about the way I looked at, say, Tiny Tim in 1962 or whenever I first saw him.
Well, he's changed.
But the way I looked at people like that, like Tiny Tim and Taylor, and the way I look at Viva and the two boys in Agnes's film, years ago when I first saw people like that, if we can put them all together, I looked at them as images. I didn't look at them as real people, and I liked the clarity of the image and the audacity of the image and a kind of warmth behind it, you know. But when I saw Agnes's film, I really liked them as people. They didn't represent hippies or people freaky or something. They just seemed very attractive, sympathetic people.
Yeah.
And it really surprises me that people have another reaction to your film.
Well, this is exactly the point I was going to make. We see that in the Woodstock phenomenon. People's minds are being changed. Stock reactions are being replaced by the reality of it, because the reality is developing. It's increasingly being shoved in all of our faces. All of us are being forced to change our minds in one way or another.
Yes, but the movies are late.
Movies are late. Well,
the
movies are late,
literature,
and
the
yet-
books, the newspaper are going
but
fast.
in a
but
sense,
the
there's no
movies are
such thing
always
as being
late.
late. I mean, everything happens in its own time. That's one way to look at it. But the point I want to make is this business about the authenticity of the person, which seems to be the bedrock category common to all sorts of different people, different filmmakers, different artists, different ideologues. And I think it's something that one becomes aware of in completely different ways in Miss Varda's film and in your film. But I would like, for perhaps the last point in the program, and I think perhaps the most important point, I think that ties in with another point. It's been remarkable to me, looking at the films in the 7th New York Film Festival, how this theme of apocalypse seems to pervade almost all of them. Films from practically every country where films are made, from France, from the U.S., from Sweden, from Poland, Eastern Europe, even from America. The sense of, on the one hand, finally finding the authentic person, or realizing that this is the search that has to be made, and at the very same time being conscious of this completely impending disaster. Marguerite Duras' film, which I saw the other night, your film in a sense,
Yes.
and even your film where you see the apocalypse on television. And I'd like to ask both of you about that. You're both international people. You travel around the world. You're intellectuals. It's a bad word. You're women. That's a good word. I'd like to ask you both to comment on this. What is this mood? Why do we all
I
feel
think there
it?
is a smell of disaster.
Because
Why?
it's
What is
really-
the disaster?
Because it's really so. I mean, because every bit of evidence that you get gives you that sense.
What is
Look at
going
what people
to
are
happen?
writing about ecology. Look at
Mhm.
the ABM. Look at the 100 Years War in Vietnam. Look at the war in Laos.
What do you think is going to happen specifically?
Well, that's not really fair.
No, I know
but,
it's not fair, but you think about
well,
it.
let's
things
say-
are bad, and one has a feeling they're going
As
to get
artists,
worse.
we feel the pressure. I mean,
Yes.
as people and as artists.
But
and
now
there is
there's-
no way to just to be light and say, let's make a comedy about Hollywood or for her. Let's make it just a
Sure.
sexy.
So that your
funny,
movie is
fancy
funny,
story.
but underneath it's not so funny.
Well, I don't know.
And your
nothing-
movie is not so
Well,
funny,
every-
but underneath it's funny.
Yeah, that's
Everybody
what I mean.
has
We
that
don't
sense.
make categories. I guess Suzanne is agreeing with me. We don't make categories. We don't want to make statesmen about.
But especially
statement
when you
about-
have contact with young people, you feel it even more. I mean, I think Agnès and I, having lived into our adult lives, are still not quite as pessimistic as 16 and 17-year-olds are. We really don't think they're going to live to grow up.
Well, what do you think? Do you have any hope? Are we going to
What?
continue to sit in our little plastic apartments and look at these assassinations on television?
Well,
And act out our star
complex
fantasies.
because in a way these three actors, these three characters in my movie, in fact they are fighting in their way of being so true. They are fighting against a certain kind of maybe plastic civilization. I don't know. I'm not making
And they're fighting against internal breakdown as well as external disaster, aren't they?
maybe, I don't know, maybe the hope is just to be to be what do you call that.
Our thanks today to Agnès Varda and Susan Sontag for being with us and for talking about their films, Lion's Love and Duet for Cannibals, respectively. Our thanks, too, to Jack Kroll, senior editor of Newsweek. Until next week, this is Jim McAndrew for Camera 3.